It's like a fairly modern science, but the first documented use of forensic entomology to solve the case actually occurred in the 13th century in China. A lawyer, Sun Tzu, recorded a case in which a field hand was murdered in a rice field using a sickle. However, all of the field hands used sickles in the rice fields, so they couldn't find a sickle and connect the murder weapon to a suspect. However, whenever they asked the field hands to show them their sickles, the flies in the air only were attracted to one specific sickle, the one that had residue of flesh and blood on it, despite looking completely clean. The field hand was promptly convicted, and the case was closed. The first actual leap forward or progress in forensic entomology occurred in the 1600s due to an Italian scientist named Francesco Redi. He disproved the myth that maggots would spontaneously generate from dead flesh by taking two hunks of meat, one covered and one uncovered, and leaving them to decompose for a couple of days. At the end of it, the uncovered meat had maggots and fly eggs all throughout it, but the one that was covered only had fly eggs and maggots on the outside, obviously disproving it. The next leap forward occurred in the 1700s to 1800s as a result of two French doctors, Orfila and Lesois. They would exhume bodies, and they specifically studied the relationships of insects to the bodies, what the insects would do and how they would benefit from them, whether or not they were eating from them or reproducing in them and having their larvae develop from them. Then the next leap forward occurred in about 50 years later, is how I've seen it specified, due to a German doctor named Reinhard. He performed mass exhumations of bodies, but rather than studying the relationships of insects to the bodies, he studied what specific insects were located on the bodies at different times by collecting samples of the insects from the bodies and sending them to an entomologist friend. Then in 1855 was the next recorded use of insects to help solve a murder trial. It was also the first time that the insect succession, or the way that insects develop on a corpse or like devour a corpse and affect corpses, was used to determine a time of death. Because a couple in France in 1855 was remodeling their house, and they found a mummified child's body located behind a mantelpiece. And they were suspected for the murder of this child, despite having reported it themselves with the workers doing the renovations, and having moved in a couple of weeks prior. But a French scientist, Bourgeois d'Arbois, he used the development of the insects to prove that the child had been killed 2 to 3 years earlier, and the couple who had previously lived in the home was convicted. The next progression or step forward in forensic entomology occurred due to a French veterinarian named Jean-Pierre Megnin. He performed a lot of research on bugs, and specifically the predictability of how they would colonize and interact with bodies after death, especially at different time intervals. And he eventually published a comprehensive book detailing 8 different ways that insects would interact and could be predicted to colonize and help decompose a body whenever it was found above ground and left above ground, and 2 different ways that insects would interact with and colonize and decompose a body that was underground. And then lastly, there was the father of forensic entomology, despite all of these previous historical occurrences, is Bernard Greenberg, a previous professor of entomology at our very own University of Illinois at Chicago. He performed so much research over the ways that especially flies would affect bodies and how they would develop, and he also helped with tens of hundreds of cases as either an expert opinion or bringing forward a key piece of evidence. And he was a pioneer in his field, and that's why he's considered the father of forensic entomology specifically. And from there, it's the historical section ends, and then we move on to the modern.
A much more modern case of forensic entomology would be the late 1900s in Texas. A woman is strangled to death, and upon the autopsy, they find a mangled grasshopper. They didn't grab anyone's attention, but as a standard procedure, it's put as evidence and stored away. As time goes on, they have suspects, and back then, that time, it was a very popular fashion to roll the cuffs on the bottom. And while interviewing these suspects, they find a grasshopper's leg in this cuff, and they realize that they have a mangled grasshopper as evidence. And they look at the two, and they're able to determine that the fractures on the grasshopper's leg and the body is the same, which basically convicted this man of murder. As you can see, the forensic entomology is starting to get very scientific, very minute details, and modern forensic entomology is starting to go towards genetics and chemistry. You can see this in the show Criminal Minds. They use techniques such as SEM, which stands for scanning electron microscopy, and potassium permanganate scanning. Both these techniques are very advanced, require equipment. The SEM basically allows us to determine what type of species the fly's larva is and tells us very specific details about it. The other technique, potassium permanganate scanning, does the exact same thing, but less expensive, requires less time, so depending on the specific case, they use a specific technique. We also use body farms, which is a mass grave of pigs, and we use pigs because they're most related to humans. So in this body farm, we're basically studying the decomposition of the pig's body and how information we could gather towards forensic entomology. Forensic entomology, like any other science, is going to continue to develop in their research as time goes on.